Life can sometimes feel overwhelming. On one sunny afternoon, a 6-year-old girl named Megan was exploring the riverbank near her father's old fishing boat in a quiet village surrounded by the forests of northern Montana. As she walked, her little feet kicked up soft clouds of dust, her pockets filled with smooth pebbles she had gathered that morning. Nearby, her father Max crouched beside a worn pile of nets, carefully mending the holes with a curved needle and strong twine. He often glanced up to check on Megan, a brief smile crossing his weathered face before returning to his task. The air was warm, heavy with the scents of pine sap, wet earth, and river mud, a comforting mix that enveloped the village like a familiar blanket. Dragonflies buzzed lazily above the water, their wings sparkling in the sunlight. The only sounds were the gentle lap of water against the bank, the occasional call of a crow overhead, and the rhythmic movement of Max's hands working the nets. As Megan's thoughts drifted to the peanut butter sandwich waiting for her lunch, maybe with a bit of jam if she was lucky, something interrupted the peaceful ambience. It wasn't the call of a bird or the splash of a jumping fish. It was a faint, strained sound, almost a whisper of pain carried by the wind. Megan froze, her pebbles falling from her fingers to the ground. She tilted her head, straining to listen, and then heard it again. A high-pitched cry that was sharp enough to break through the warm haze and buzzing insects. Feeling a mix of curiosity and concern, Megan tiptoed closer to the water's edge, gently pushing aside the tall grass that grew along the bank. She stood on her tiptoes, peering over the glistening water. Initially, she saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the shimmering reflections of trees and sky. But then her eyes caught movement behind a cluster of driftwood stuck along the shore. As she squinted, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, her breath caught in her throat. There, struggling weakly among the debris, was a small, trembling figure, brownish-gray and soaked. It was a young bobcat, desperately trying to keep its head above water. "Hey, little guy," she called out instinctively, her voice rising in urgency. "Come here." But the bobcat didn't move toward her. Instead, it let out a weak, broken cry, its small body thrashing against something unseen. As Megan stepped closer, she gasped. It wasn't just floating there by chance. A thick, heavy rope was wound around the animal's midsection, disappearing into the water below. Now Megan could see that the rope was anchored to something beneath the surface, holding the struggling creature like a cruel trap. A wave of horror washed over her. She knew she couldn't just stand idly by. She turned and ran, pebbles scattering from her pockets as her voice pierced the heavy air. "Daddy, Daddy, something's wrong!" Max looked up sharply, his instincts kicking in before he fully understood her words. He dropped the net and began to sprint, his boots thumping against the hard-packed dirt as he raced toward his daughter. Megan pointed frantically at the river, her tiny hand shaking with urgency. Without hesitation, Max scanned the water, quickly spotting the frantic flashes of movement. In one swift motion, he kicked off his boots and tossed aside his fishing hat, plunging into the river without a second thought. The water was colder than he had expected, fed by snowmelt from the distant mountains. The shock of the cold stole his breath, but he pressed on, arms pushing through the water. The current was surprisingly strong, swirling around his legs and threatening to knock him off balance. He gritted his teeth, fighting against it with every step, keeping his eyes fixed on the terrified little animal. As he approached, he noticed the bobcat's struggles growing weaker. The rope was cutting into its wet fur, leaving raw patches where the skin had rubbed away. His heart ached at the sight, but he remained calm. If he startled the bobcat, it might injure itself even more. Reaching out slowly, he spoke in soothing tones. "Easy, buddy, easy. I got you." The bobcat instinctively lashed out, its tiny claws swiping through the air, but it was too exhausted to do any real harm. Max gripped the rope just above the animal, feeling the weight of whatever was tied to the other end. It took all his strength to resist the river's pull, but with a determined yank, he dislodged the anchor, a rusted chunk of iron and chain, half buried in the muddy riverbed. Max staggered back, holding the bobcat gently against his chest to protect it from the biting wind. He could feel its tiny heart racing against him, and the little creature was trembling so much it felt nearly electric. Its fur was soaked, weighed down by water, and its body felt alarmingly light, as if it had already begun to suffer from hunger. Megan stood by the riverbank, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. As Max stumbled out of the water, clothes dripping and boots squelching in the mud, she took a step back to give him space. He carefully knelt on a patch of sun-warmed grass and placed the bobcat down with great care. Max examined the small animal, his fingers moving gently to check for broken bones or cuts. This bobcat was just a few months old, but Megan noticed the cruel marks on its body. Its whiskers had been roughly clipped, and the tips of its ears were ragged and bloody. It was clear someone had harmed it before attempting to drown it. Max muttered a soft curse under his breath, something Megan rarely heard from him. Without a second thought, he took off his thick fishing jacket. He wrapped the soaked, shivering bobcat in it, creating a warm cocoon to shield it from the wind. Turning to Megan, he spoke softly but firmly. "Stay close, sweetheart. We need to get this little guy some help." They hurried back to their old pickup truck, which had seen better days. Max drove barefoot, with his wet pants leaving puddles on the worn floor mats. The truck, a dented blue vehicle from a different era, started with a reluctant groan. Megan climbed onto the cracked vinyl seat, keeping the bundled bobcat close to her chest. She could feel its fragile ribs moving, each shiver echoing through the damp fabric of the fishing jacket. Instinctively, she began to whisper softly to it, her voice a soothing comfort against the harsh reality they had just escaped. "You're gonna be okay," she murmured, her hands trembling as they stroked its wet fur. "You'll be okay, little guy. I promise." The road ahead was winding and rough, cutting through dense trees of pine and spruce. Max gripped the steering wheel tightly, glancing over at Megan every few moments. The truck bounced over potholes and loose gravel, but Max hardly noticed. His thoughts were a whirlwind. How could someone treat a living creature so cruelly? It was hard to understand how anyone could look into the eyes of an animal and decide it deserved such a terrible fate. Thankfully, they were only 20 minutes away from the nearest veterinary clinic, which nestled next to an old general store with a sagging porch. The clinic was a modest building with sun-bleached siding and a crooked sign that read, "Hammond's Animal Care." Dr. Hammond, a retired wildlife vet known for his gentle touch and strong sense of care, ran the place. He had built a reputation in the village as someone everyone could trust, and Max wished they wouldn't arrive too late. The truck skidded into the dirt lot, kicking up dust and pebbles. Max barely turned off the engine before he jumped out, cradling the bobcat in his arms. Megan followed closely behind, her legs tense from worry. Together, they pushed through the clinic door, which chimed as they entered. The receptionist, a woman with gray hair and a loose bun, gasped when she saw them. They were wet, muddy, and carrying a small, still bundle. "Please," Max said, his voice hoarse as he approached the counter. "My daughter found him tied to a river anchor. We need help now." Without hesitation, the receptionist reached for the door leading to the back. Moments later, Dr. Hammond appeared, wiping his hands on a towel. His sharp eyes softened at the sight of the bobcat. "Bring him back here," he said, his voice steady. The next few hours passed in a blur filled with the scent of antiseptic and the quiet hum of equipment. Megan perched on a worn plastic chair, which creaked with every move. She clutched a damp jacket to her chest, long after the bobcat had been taken for examination. Her feet swung above the floor, brushing against the scuffed tiles as she waited. Occasionally, she stole glances at Max. He sat beside her, elbows on his knees, running his hands through his damp hair in anxious motions. Time felt strange. Moments seemed to stretch out while also flying by. Nurses moved in and out of the back, carrying supplies and speaking softly. Megan imagined she could still hear the faint cries of the bobcat echoing somewhere behind the clinic walls. Whispering to herself and to the bobcat, she urged, "Hang on. You have to hang on." Finally, the moments piled up as they awaited news, each second heavy with hope. After what seemed like a long wait, Dr. Hammond came back. He looked tired but collected, a bit of antiseptic smeared on his sleeve. His expression was serious, but not overwhelmingly so. Max stood right up, and Megan followed closely behind him. "You're lucky you found him when you did," Dr. Hammond said, running a hand through his graying beard. He was hypothermic and quite traumatized. but with time and care, he should fully recover. Unfortunately, there's no microchip or ID, someone clearly intended for him to drown. Still, he's a fighter. Megan, despite feeling heavy-hearted, began to feel a flicker of hope. Without thinking, she blurted out a question that had been on her mind. "Can we keep him?" Max opened his mouth to speak, but Dr. Hammond chuckled softly and raised a hand. "Let's focus on getting him stabilized first," he suggested kindly. "If you're willing to take on the responsibility and understand what it means to care for a wild animal, I don't see why not." Relief washed over Megan's face, and she nodded enthusiastically. Max offered a small, tired smile and gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. In the following weeks, their cabin at the edge of the woods became a refuge for healing and cautious optimism. Megan named the bobcat Axel, inspired by the brave little hero from her favorite storybook, the one who faced monsters and helped lost travelers. It felt fitting. Axel, small and battered, had already survived his own brand of monsters. However, the road to recovery was not without challenges. Axel remained skittish for a time, flinching at loud sounds or quick movements. Megan quickly learned to take things slow and speak softly. There were moments when Axel would sit for hours by the cabin window, his golden eyes fixed on the thick woods, his body tense with unseen anxiety. To help Axel adjust, Max built a spacious enclosure attached to the cabin. It allowed him to roam comfortably, climb sturdy branches, bask in the sun, and observe the world around him in safety. Every day after her chores, Megan would curl up on a wooden bench next to the enclosure and read aloud from her storybooks. She shared tales about the river, the stars, and the good people in the world who would never harm him. Slowly, but surely, Axel began to inch closer during those story times, his round ears twitching in response to her gentle voice. News of Megan and her river bobcat spread through the village, captivating the residents. Some reacted with surprise and curiosity, while others, the community was shocked and saddened that someone could act with such cruelty in their otherwise peaceful town. Some residents simply shook their heads, resigned to the fact that even the most beautiful places can harbor darkness. As the sheriff began an investigation, it became clear that there were no leads and no one came forward to take responsibility. Whoever had committed the act seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Max didn't press Megan about that troubling afternoon. He felt there was no need to. His support was enough. Each night he hugged her a bit tighter, softly reminding her how proud he was and how brave she had been. He taught her to be patient with Axel, to recognize when the bobcat needed space, and to understand the unspoken language of fear and trust that played out in every flick of his tail and careful step. Then summer arrived, bringing warm light and soft breezes that painted the trees in vibrant shades of green and gold. Axel steadily grew stronger, his coat regained its rich gloss, and his movements shifted from hesitant to adventurous. The fear slowly dissipated from his eyes, making way for curiosity and playfulness. It wasn't unusual for Axel to jump onto Max's workbench unexpectedly, sending fishing hooks and lures scattering in every direction. Megan couldn't contain her giggles as Max tried to scold the bobcat, often finding himself laughing instead. Megan and Axel formed an inseparable bond. It was a connection that transcended words, woven through every moment they spent together. Each morning, before the sun fully rose, Megan would sneak outside to find Axel already waiting by the cabin door. With a gentle nuzzle of her hand and his tail swishing in excitement, they would set off on their daily adventures. They dashed between trees and weaved through tall grass, with Megan's joyous laughter echoing like a song as Axel chased her in playful circles. He was always careful, even when he leaped around. Not once did he scratch her. He instinctively knew she was his person. At times, they would lie side by side in the grass, watching clouds drift lazily across the expansive Montana sky. Megan confided in Axel, sharing her fears, hopes, and questions about life. She whispered her dreams into his tufted ears, dreams of becoming a veterinarian or even a wildlife ranger. She envisioned herself as a protector of animals, ensuring that none would have to endure the kind of suffering Axel had experienced. She promised him that one day they would create a sanctuary together, a place where animals could roam free and joyful. Axel listened intently, his heavy eyelids barely open, The rhythm of his breathing mirrored a sense of calm, as if answering unspoken hopes. One evening, as summer began to fade into fall and the sunlight softened to a golden hue, Megan and Max found comfort on the porch swing. It gently creaked beneath them while they enjoyed the view of a sky painted in shades of rose, amber, and hints of lavender, all stretching toward the nearby mountains. At their feet, Axel lay curled up, his nose tucked beneath his tail. The crisp air carried the scent of drying leaves and distant pine smoke, filling the atmosphere with an essence of fullness, like holding on to a deep breath at sunset. Megan leaned into Max, her voice soft as the breeze rustling through the trees. "Daddy, do you think he remembers that he was almost gone?" she asked, her curiosity evident. Max sat in silence for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last sliver of sunlight sank behind the ridge. "Maybe," he finally replied, "but I think what he remembers more is that you were the one who called for help. You were his voice when he needed it most." Looking down at Axel, Megan straightened her lips into a thoughtful line. She gently placed her hand on his back, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breath beneath her palm. "Then I'm glad I was there," she said with quiet sincerity. Max smiled, and in that serene moment, nothing else seemed to matter. Life's challenges can sometimes pull us under, deeper than we believe we can handle. But in those moments, when darkness feels all-consuming, a small voice can emerge, a whisper of courage that breaks through the silence. This was a lesson Megan learned on the riverbank when she chose not to walk away. Max had also embraced that truth, and they both carried it with them, woven into the fabric of their lives, a reminder of what love is capable of. Once weighed down by despair and the depths of a river, Axel now ran freely through open fields, chasing butterflies with the joyful lightness of one who has discovered their freedom. Under the stars, he slept soundly with his belly exposed to the wide sky, reassured that he was no longer in danger. He had a family, a place, and a name: Axel the survivor, Axel the loved. As autumn made its presence known in the village, days grew shorter and the cool air hinted at transformation. Golden leaves cascaded from trees, and the mountains shimmered as if set ablaze. Still, Axel remained a consistent presence. His enclosure had evolved into more than just a shelter. It was a kingdom built from logs and branches, sunbeams and leaves. Megan found herself spending hours in that little world, reflecting on the journey that had led them to this moment. Megan loved spending her time sketching animals in her notebook, or simply sitting in the peaceful woods with her dog, Axel. However, starting school that fall made things feel different. The morning routine shifted, and the house became quieter than she was used to. Yet, every day without fail, Axel would walk her to the edge of the woods. He would sit there, alert and attentive, watching the yellow school bus until it turned down the dirt road and disappeared. Afterward, he would slip into the underbrush, only to return every afternoon right when Megan stepped onto the gravel driveway. As soon as she arrived, laughter would fill the air. She would drop her backpack and Axel would joyfully race in circles around her, chirping and nuzzling her like a burst of sunlight streaming through the trees. One chilly afternoon, just before Halloween, Megan was found sitting quietly near Axel's enclosure. She hugged her knees to her chest, wrapped in a blanket, as the crisp air hinted at frost in the coming days, and the scent of wood smoke lingered on her clothes. Her dad, Max, joined her in silence for a moment. They both watched Axel pacing back and forth inside his enclosure, his tail flicking and his eyes alert yet calm. It was then that Megan broke the silence. Her voice was soft and tentative. "Daddy, do you think someone hurt Axel because they thought he was bad?" Max took a deep breath, sensing the weight of her question. He responded gently, "Sometimes people hurt what they don't understand. It's not because they're bad, but because their fear makes it hard for them to be kind." Megan nodded slowly, taking in her father's words. Her eyes drifted to Axel, who had since sprawled out on the ground, soaking up the last rays of the sun. "But he knows better now, right?" she asked, her voice filled with a hint of hope. "He knows he's loved." Max wrapped his arm around her shoulders and reassured her. "I think he knows that very well." As Halloween approached, Megan was determined to include Axel in the festivities. For days, she worked on a costume, a small, soft cape made from an old blue fabric, complete with a felt star stitched onto the back, just like the heroes in her storybooks. She practiced coaxing Axel into wearing it, rewarding him with bits of cooked chicken and lots of enthusiastic praise. On Halloween night, with a basket of candy by the cabin door and paper lanterns gently glowing in the trees, Megan finally managed to put the cape on Axel. For 5 glorious minutes, he wore it with pride. Then, with a quick and graceful swipe of his paw, he freed himself in one swift motion, leaving the cape fluttering softly to the ground behind him. Axel pranced around the yard, head held high and tail flicking with playful energy. Megan and Max erupted into laughter, tears of joy streaming down their cheeks as they watched Axel strut like a champion. The cape trailing behind him danced in the wind, almost like a victory banner. That winter came early, blanketing the village in thick layers of snow. However, the little family was well prepared. Max had stacked firewood beside the cabin and sealed the windows to keep the cold out. He even checked the generator twice to make sure everything was ready. Each evening, the hearth inside glowed warmly, casting playful shadows on the log walls. Megan created a cozy bed for Axel using old flannel shirts and extra quilts, placing it right next to the fire. This spot quickly became his favorite during the long, quiet nights, especially when the wind howled outside like an unsettling spirit. On those nights, Axel would curl up with his paws tucked under his chin and his tail wrapped around his body. Sometimes, Megan would wander from her room, troubled by bad dreams, and curl up beside him, burying her face in his soft fur. His warmth and the gentle rhythm of his breathing brought her reassurance, far more soothing than any nightlight. In the mornings, Max would find them both tangled in a nest of blankets and fur, their faces relaxed and peaceful. He would pause for a moment, soaking in the sight, feeling a deep, sacred joy that words could hardly capture. Life's challenges can feel overwhelming. It's true that the world can be harsh and unpredictable. Yet there are times when it offers a gentle reminder of hope, a second chance, a small nudge toward better days. Sometimes, all it takes is a child's voice calling from a riverbank. Other times, a simple act of love and the steady courage to believe in healing can ignite hope. In these moments, hope is reborn, one heart, one whispered promise at a time.